Good evening. I'm Andrew Del Banco. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. I'll be very brief so as not to steal time from the conversation. I am wearing three hats tonight, if that's not too grotesque a metaphor. So I welcome you on behalf of the Center for American Studies, which I direct here at Columbia, the Library of America, on whose board it is my great privilege to sit, and the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, to which I like to think I'm a friend, and as Jeremy Dalbir will certainly agree, an enthusiastic kibitzer. Tonight marks the second partnership event of our three organizations, and we anticipate many more. Last year, we celebrated on this stage the publication of Ilan Stavan's wonderful book about American immigrant writing, with conversation between Jhumpa Lahiri and Gary Steingart. This year, we've ratcheted up to three major figures of the American theater in conversation with Laurence Senelick, editor of this wonderful book that we're celebrating tonight, The American Stage, Writing on Theater from Washington Irving to Tony Kushner. My colleague, Max Rudin, publisher of the Library of America, will speak about the book in a moment. In planning tonight's program, we wanted, of course, to cover the whole span of the book, but we were not able to get Washington Irving, whose agent told us what agents always tell you when they don't like the terms, namely that Mr. Irving had a previous engagement. But we're thrilled that Tony Kushner, Tovah Feldshuh, and Gregory Mosher were free and willing to join us, and we're grateful to all of them. I want to share just one note from the book, which I think helps explain the naturalness of our partnership tonight. It's from Tony's very moving memorial essay about Arthur Miller, whose play A View from the Bridge, as I'm sure you know, has recently been brilliantly reinterpreted by Greg Mosher. In that essay, Tony uses the phrase demanding interiority to describe Miller's imagination. Such interiority is hardly an exclusively Jewish theme, but it does help to explain why tonight's program and sponsorship make sense to us. The book we celebrate is about American culture in general, about drama in particular, and not incidentally, in my view at least, about the movement of Jews from the periphery to the center of American cultural life. So let me offer again a warm welcome. Thank you very much for coming, and I'll turn the podium over to Max.
Thanks, Andy. On behalf of the Library of America, our president, Cheryl Hurley, our directors and staff, welcome, and thanks again to Andrew Del Banco and Jeremy Dalbir, our partners this evening. As you may know, the Library of America is a nonprofit enterprise dedicated to making permanently available authoritative editions of great American writing. And several years ago, we began talking to Laurence Senelick about an idea he'd had. What would it be like to gather in one place the incredibly diverse writing about American theater, not just about drama as literature, but open it up to live theatrical performance as an exhilarating shared experience available to everyone. A book where Eugene O'Neill and David Mamet, Barry Moore's Hamlet, and Brando's Stanley Kowalski would rub shoulders with vaudeville, burlesque, and melodrama, Yiddish theater, and the Chitlin circuit. With hit makers like Kaufman and Hart grabbing the audience with relentlessly honed rewrites and stage business, alongside experimental troops grabbing the audience by grabbing the audience. A book, in other words, that would match the wild and woolly, try anything and everything energy of the American stage, its sights, its sounds, and in its pre-Civil War beginnings, even its whiskey-tinged smells. The only criteria was that the writer had to have first-hand experience of the magic of the theater on either side of the footlights, and the gift to express and reflect it in writing that feels alive. The result, several years later, is this book, edited with style, wit, and daunting erudition by Laurence, who was Fletcher Professor of Drama and Oratory at Tufts, and who this past summer became the first theater scholar elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. There are many pleasures in the book, as you'll discover. For one, the behind-the-scenes look at legendary productions, like John Lahr on his father Bert, the great burlesque comedian who went on to grapple with the role of Estragon in the Broadway premiere of Waiting for Godot. The director, meanwhile, tearing his hair out, trying to convince Bert Lahr that in this kind of show, there isn't really such thing as a top banana. It's the rare case of a book where the editor's notes are as informative and entertaining as the text itself. One note provides a one-paragraph whistle-stop tour of American melodrama, including the first father to turn an erring daughter out into a snowstorm, and the first utterance of the line, "Quit this house and never darken the threshold of its door again." In fact, I was thinking before tonight's event that it might just be possible from the notes to this book to actually construct a timeline of American theater in one-liners, which I didn't have time to do, but I will just offer you one example. For the 1930s, radical playwright Clifford Odets quits the Communist Party to write for the movies. Screenwriter Frank Nugent responds to his new work, "Odets, where is thy sting?" Taken together, the 78 men and women in American stage tell a new kind of first-hand history of theater in America, a richer and more various story than we're used to. But they also speak to us for another reason, maybe a deeper reason, because they speak in a familiar American accent of old mysteries. How something so evanescent as a theatrical performance can be more deeply and more indelibly memorable than our lived lives. How theater can be both a wonderful festival, a daydream factory, and also what Arthur Miller calls a doorway through which the great answers wait. Miller, in the book, tells a story about Death of a Salesman. Lee J. Cobb sat like a lump all through rehearsals, heavy-eyed, morose, a mourning walrus, is how Miller describes him. Then one afternoon, he rose from his chair, looked at Millie Dunnock, playing Linda, and everything went silent. And then he said, "I was driving along, you understand, and then all of a sudden I'm going off the road." Miller writes, "And the theater vanished. The stage vanished. The chill of an age-old recognition shuddered my spine." What you might call the deep history of the American stage is written in moments like these. The memory of them, the reverence for them, the dream to create and be part of them. They are, of course, in the collaborative art of the theater, born of the combined gifts of actor, director, and playwright. We have the incredible good fortune to have joining Laurence Senelick on the stage tonight, one of each, three of the most extraordinarily gifted theater people of this or any generation. Like O'Neill and Williams before him, preeminent American playwright Tony Kushner is constantly breaking new thematic and stylistic ground. And like Arthur Miller before him, defining what it means to be a political playwright in the largest sense for our place and time. His seminal masterpiece, Angels in America, is about to be revived by the Signature Theater Company. Acclaimed, award-winning stage and screen actress Tovah Feldshuh is living proof that artistic integrity and star power can cohabit in one person. She has triumphed in roles ranging from Yentl to Tallulah Bankhead, not to mention as Golda Meir in the longest-running one-woman show in Broadway history. Through October 31st, she stars in the Nora and Delia Ephron hit Love, Loss, and What I Wore at the West Side Theater. Gregory Mosher has directed and produced over 200 plays on Broadway and off, here and abroad, and won every major theater award. He's worked with Tennessee Williams and Samuel Beckett, among many other of our greatest playwrights and actors, and is perhaps best known for his legendary collaborations with David Mamet. Professor of theater at Columbia and director of its arts initiative, he took a little time off in the past year to mount an acclaimed revival of Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge, which earned him a 2010 Tony nomination for Best Director. Please welcome Tovah Feldshuh, Tony Kushner, Gregory Mosher, and Laurence Senelick.
What I'd like to do tonight is create a kind of dialogue between the past and the present. We have here what is the creation of a new theater? When I was a young actor, I was once told that anything you do in the theater twice becomes a tradition. And tradition is what the anthology is very much about. The anthology is, in fact, a creation of people who, from the very beginnings of the American theater, although they may have been unaware of it, were putting down footprints that others were following, and those others were then diverging into other paths, and the whole thing gets braided into what we now see as the contemporary American theater represented by the people on this stage. So what I'm going to suggest tonight is a very informal conversation. I am going to throw out a topic or a question and ask the panelists to respond to it. They and I have picked out some passages in the book from the past in which those topics may be addressed. So you'll hear the dead and the living together. And the very first question I do want to throw out is tradition. So often when you enter a rehearsal room, when you begin to write a play, you are told you can or can't do this or that because it isn't what used to be done. And I was wondering if any of you have come across that experience of either finding a tradition that was helpful to you or a tradition that stood in your way. No particular order. Anybody who wants to respond?
I was trained by Michael Langham at the Guthrie Theatre and by a British phenomenal director. Very, very tough. He hazed. Oh, I was a McKnight Fellow. I carried spears and understudied all the leading ladies who were size 7. At that time, it was Roberta Maxwell and Diane Wiest. And in all events, we learned things like Gielgud saying, "Lift it so I can take it." That my obligation tonight is to make sure that I'm audible, so I assume you can all understand me? Yeah, that's very important. That's the core of my job, is to make sure that my vowels and consonants are in order so that you can apprehend what I'm trying to communicate to you. With the advent of reality TV, and the advent of movie stars coming to Broadway, some of whom are very skilled, some of whom are not skilled at all for the stage, things have started to happen with the audibility of different acting styles, and particularly in choral pieces. For instance, in Love, Loss, and What I Wore, there are pieces called the clothesline pieces, where all 5 actresses have to go along. And if you have somebody purely from a TV tradition, what sometimes happens is that the bottom drops when that person takes the ball, because they do not pitch it with the intent to include a room of, I would say, around 200 people tonight, maybe slightly more. But my intention is that beige wall, and that was taught to me by Langham. So that's a particular example of how unamplified there still has to be intent to include, and that has changed in my career. That would be, if you were inaudible at the Guthrie, forget about it. You were out of there, you know. So this is a different acting style. And on the other hand, we don't declaim the way the people who did the Del Sartre technique did. The coming of Lee Strasberg in the studio made the interior experience of the actor much clearer to a whole generation of actors, starting with, for me, Brando, Eli Wallach, Ann Jackson, and then we were their children. We were their children.
I mean, I have been feeling, I was a graduate student in directing at NYU, and there was a text teacher there named Nora Dunphy who died. Did you know Nora?
No, I had Edith Warman Skinner from the Juilliard.
She sounds like sort of cut from the same cloth.
Yes.
Nora, if you are curious, you can see, if you Netflix Forrest Gump, she's the old woman sitting on the bench listening to Tom Hanks. Oh. And she was an amazing text teacher, and she had this sort of technique of teaching text by driving people crazy. She would say, you know, the unencumbered, I don't know. That's another good example.
Did she deal with R coloring?
Coloring. The green grass. She would say, what kind of grass? You would say the green grass. what kind of grass? It was green grass. And you make her repeat it, and then she go, what was green? The grass. And you repeat it over and over and over again. And I feel, I didn't study playwriting with anyone, really. I mean, I took 6 weeks of classes with Jean-Claude Van Italy because I found a poster in the laundromat in Brooklyn where he was advertising classes that I could afford. But I feel that the work with Nora on textual specificity was an enormous help. And that's also, I think, in addition to projection and using consonants and vowels in a certain way, there's a textual specificity that I think has gotten lost to a certain degree, and I think that it's for text-heavy work an incredibly important ingredient in writing. I mean, when I first came to New York, it was in the mid-'70s, and so I arrived in sort of the glory days of American avant-garde theater. I mean, the real culmination, I think, when the Wooster Group and Mabu Mines and Robert Wilson and Richard Foreman were doing a lot of their most exciting work. And Chaikin, the Open Theater was a little bit earlier, but Chaikin was still around and doing, I saw a few things that he did with his production of Endgame at Manhattan Theater Club, which was one of the greatest things I've ever seen. But I didn't feel like there were many rules that needed to be obeyed because I was seeing so many extraordinary things that simply defied all categories. So I never felt particularly bound in by tradition.
You had to be heard. It was before, I remember when Jack Lemmon was the first movie star I saw amplified in a play. It was like a scandal. You were never amplified in a play. You really weren't. Maybe there were mics here. But in 1973, 74, I did a Cyrano with Chris Plummer, and Chris Plummer was body mic'd, but nobody else was body mic'd. Maybe Chris Plummer and Roxanne. That was it. And this was a Broadway musical at the Palace. By 74, we did Rodgers and Hart. It was all singing. We were all body mic'd. But then I did Yentl. We were never mic'd. Never. You know, it was unheard of.
It's interesting that miking Plummer and nobody else is actually part of a tradition. A very old actor who had worked with Henry Irving told me that when Irving, in the 1890s, had a major speech he wanted to deliver, he would come down stage center and he would stomp on the stage. That was to tell the gas man to turn up the flares in the footlights so that he would be lit more at that moment than anybody else. Greg?
I came into the theater in the 60s, so the whole thing was to get rid of tradition and the people you've just mentioned. And so it was, in my private life, I was reading everything, Ibsen and all the 19th century writers and trying to learn from them. But when I would get into the rehearsal room, it was down with Miller, down with Williams, Odette. Who was Odette? Nobody cared about Odette. And it was only later that I came back to understand how great these people were. I was well into I only wanted to do new plays.
But do you find that a loss? That there is a tradition that people have grown up in and all of a sudden it's cut off?
There's a discontinuity, and it happened during that period, it seems to me. There's no sense. I have students who have never read A Streetcar Named Desire. I mean, we're not talking about No Streetcar Cold, the way a musician would know what the oboes are doing in the third movement of Beethoven's Seventh. They just haven't read it. And
what do they know instead?
They know contemporary playwrights. They know Tony. They know but they know writers who are writing now, who they can go see. But to go and read a book, to go to the library, to take 15 plays home with you, and that's this week's reading in addition to your regular classwork, that's gone, I think.
I've always found it sort of shocking how little acquainted American theater students are with European writers like Heiner Mueller. I mean, except for the most famous like Beckett and sometimes Brecht. The whole, and anything that's pre-20th century, forget about it. I mean, no one's read Schiller, no one's read, and that's terrible. There's also very little opportunity to see any of that on the stage. One thing that's interesting, though, is that in that period of avant-gardism, I mean, there were, the Wooster Group was doing a series of radical reinterpretations of American classics. But I actually first became interested again in Arthur Miller during the controversy over LSD, Just the High Points, when Miller, Liz Lecomte, and the Wooster Group did this absolutely astonishing production that was in some ways sort of based on, it's like kind of a combination of the McCarthy hearings, of the Army McCarthy hearings, and the Crucible, which is the test they were using. And Arthur stepped in and stopped the production. And I'd always had a certain, I mean, when I was in high school, everybody always did dramatic readings from the Crucible, so I sort of grown up with an allergy to the play, and it really felt sort of, and as you were saying, I mean, everything was Brecht for me, so Arthur Miller was just this genius old American sellout when I was a college student. And then I thought, well, why would somebody as smart as Elizabeth LeCompte be interested in the Crucible? And I also listened to some of the words and the lines that they were playing around with in that production. And I went back and I reread the Crucible and thought, oh my God, this is an extraordinary play. And then I started rereading all of Miller, and so it wasn't an entirely discontinuous thing. There was a...
Maybe this is a good segue, Greg.
Oh, we're so Millered up already, but Laurence asked us to choose, and I thought I'd go for a bank shot and do Tony on Arthur. But now, I didn't think you were going to come to me right away. Here we go. This is the last essay in the book, so we're working as we often do. And I'm skipping around a little bit. Arthur demanded that we must be able to answer on behalf of our plays, our endeavors, our lives, a really tough question. One that Arthur wrote was the chief and, in a sense, only reason for writing and speaking. What is its relevancy, he asked, to the survival of the race? Not, he stipulates, the American race or the Jewish race or the German race, but the human race. He demanded that our work and our lives have some relevance to human survival. The question implies anxiety. I don't think my mic's on, is it? Can you hear me?
Yes,
it is? Good. Sorry to screw up your prose. He demanded that our work and our lives have some relevance to human survival. The question implies anxiety about that survival, a refusal of complacency, an acknowledgement that there is human community for which each of us bears responsibility, and a warning that we are in danger. Miller tells us that what we do, the things we choose to struggle with in art and elsewhere, can have some effect on the outcome. There is, in other words, reason to hope, and change is possible. Arthur was a grieving pessimist, but what truly progressive person isn't? And I think I'll leave it for there right now.
Okay. One of the things that's come up in this discussion so far, with the lack of cultural background on the part of students in this case, is what audiences bring to a show. One of the individuals I discovered in putting together this anthology was someone named Charles King Newcomb, who was a kind of fellow traveler with the Transcendentalists in New England, and then moved to Philadelphia and kept a diary as a bachelor. And he keeps talking about going to seeing Shakespeare. And in the course of a year, he can see Hamlet innumerable times with different actors, and he knows the script cold. If they change a word, he puts it down in his diary and says, they didn't use the word whore, they used the word harlot. And even in the 20s, you get Stark Young writing a wonderful critique of John Barrymore's Hamlet, and he's able to compare it to any number of Hamlets he's seen up to that point. How many people do you imagine would have seen a production of View from the Bridge in order to compare it to yours?
They saw the revival 10 years ago. Oh, that wonderful
Thousand Jane.
But then it falls off after that. And that's a mixed blessing. You know, you want it to be seen in perspective, but how wonderful to have someone come and know and figure out 20 minutes in, this guy has a thing for his niece. You know, that's a pretty great, how great to see Hamlet and not know that he's going to die. You dream of that. You know.
I suppose so. The blank slate audience. Yeah, right. Tovah, would you like to read the piece about Ibsen? Because I think that fits in here nicely.
I realize as we're talking, I was originally a classical pianist. And I think early in my life, I had great faith in the classics. So I went to Sarah Lawrence to balance off. I remember Dean Fitzgerald at Scarsdale High saying, go to Sarah Lawrence. I was accepted at Vassar and Smith and rejected at Holyoke. And anyway, go to Sarah Lawrence. It's so creative, and you're creative, and blah, 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 blah. So I went to Sarah Lawrence. When my mother came, Joe Chaikin was my teacher. We did Renard the Fox by Stravinsky. I had a green wig and purple teeth, and my mother said to me, Tovah, why didn't you go to Vassar? I'll never forget it. Oh, God, she's going to be 100, my mother. Okay. This is a dialogue between Alexander Walcott and one of his favorite actresses, Mrs. Fisk, about Ibsen. Mrs. Fisk says, "How can we persuade people to turn back to the plays and reread them for the color, the romance, the life that there's in them? Where in all the world of modern drama, for instance, is there a comedy so buoyant, so dazzlingly joyous as An Enemy of the People?" "They say he's parochial," says Alexander Walcott. "Let them say it," says Mrs. Fisk. "They said it of Hedda, but that poor, empty little Norwegian neurotic has been recognized all over the world. The trouble with Hedda is not that she's parochial, but that she is poor and empty. She was fascinating to play, and I suppose that every actress goes through the same phase of being especially attracted by such characters, a part of the phase when the eagerness to study life takes the form of an interest in the eccentric, abnormal, distorted, the perverted aspects of life. As a rôle," and that's how it's written, as a rôle with a circumflex, Hedda is a marvelous portrait. As a person, she's empty. After all, the empty, evil, selfish persons are not worth our time, either yours or mine, in the theater any more than in life. They do not matter. They do not count. They're enormously unimportant. On the highway of life, the Hedda gabblers are just so much impedimenta. Do you recall," says Alexander Walcott, that is the very word Caesar used for baggage?" Whereat Mrs. Fisk smiled so approvingly that I knew poor Hedda would be impedimenta to the end of the chapter. "But she is universal," says Mrs. Fisk. "She was recognized all over the world. London saw her at every dinner table, and I have watched a great auditorium in the far west, a place as large as our Metropolitan, held enthralled by that brilliant comedy." And there we have it. Go figure.
One of my intentions when I put together this anthology, after all, it was for the Library of America. The Library of America is meant to be a repository of the best American writing. So I was looking for pieces that were exceptionally well written and entertaining to read, both aloud and to oneself. And that became harder and harder as I got closer and closer to the contemporary theater, because many of the middle-brow magazines of the past, for which much of this writing was done, no longer exist, because the readership no longer exists. This may be invidious, but I picked up recently that big anthology, of American Theater, the magazine, 25 years of American theater, and half the book is interviews. Now, I included 2 interviews in the anthology. One of the interviews was by one of the inventors of the form, Alan Dale, in the late 19th century. And it's a very clever interview of Clara Morris, where he walks a kind of knife edge between respect and sarcasm. The other was the one that Tovah just read excerpts from, in which Alexander Walcott turns an interview with Mrs. Fisk into a one-act play, basically, a conversazione. It's a wonderful essay. Nowadays, interviews are simply transcriptions from recordings. Nobody manipulates them, turns them into little works of art. And I was wondering if in general, here we bring up the issue of critics, whether you have found that writing about the theater has changed over the course of your careers.
Well, I don't know if the writing has, but thrillingly, the media has. When I came to Broadway in the 70s, you lived and died over one review. One. There was a monopoly. I can't even describe it. In 1973, when Cyrano opened, there were 8 shows on Broadway. We were in a recession. And if you didn't get the imprimatur of the Times, you were screwed. That was it. And then people like Barry and Fran Weisler, good merchants, figured out how to market their plays no matter what the reviews were, no matter what. And certain plays that were not critical hits became commercial hits, which for an actor is a wonderful thing. Because we give our time and our love and our energy to something that we don't prejudge as a hit or a flop. You give it your best shot, no matter what. And actually, I find, I don't know if there's an evener field of play, but it seems to me that there are more opinions with the coming of the internet and blogging and Twitter and Facebook, where you can sell your product not through the old channels. Likewise, of course, television. I don't know if that doesn't answer your question about writing, but it answers it about...
No, but it does open another question, which is opinion the same as criticism?
I was just going to talk about engagement. When I went to Chicago in 1974, because I could not get a job in New York, I had just left school, there were 5 theater companies, counting the dinner theater, where you could get a show and dinner for $11. And the Gabor sisters came to town, and they ratcheted up to $13, which prompted a critic, Lenny Kleinfeld, who ran under the name Bury St. Edmund, $13 to see the Gabors. You can sleep with them for $8. And 5 years later, there were 40 theater companies. And 5 years after that, there were 100 theater companies. And if anyone in this room, I'm sure, knows, there are probably 200 theater companies in Chicago now. 3 people, aside from Lenny, who was writing for The Reader, were essential for that. Glenna Seiss, who wrote for the Sun-Times, Linda Weiner, who's now in New York, and Dick Christensen. And they went to every storefront, and they covered you as if you were Mrs. Fisk. And they just didn't care. And that's why there is an American Buffalo, and that's why there's a Steppenwolf Theater Company, because they just trotted up to the northern suburbs or the south side or some little moose hall, and they covered your work, and they covered it tough, and they covered it with love. And there would be no Chicago theater without at least those 4 people, and probably others. I mean, Roger Detmer. I mean, you go down the list. They took it seriously. And David will tell you this, the Steppenwolf kids will tell you this.
And opinion isn't the same as criticism. Of course not. Of course not. The question is, where does the power reside, and how do we get asses in the seats? Because that's the job of the producer.
Tony, what did you read growing up about the theater rather than just plays?
As opposed to asses writing criticism.
The asses in the seats. Derrieres, if you prefer. I'm in silk tonight.
You know, I have to say, the only people who wanted this book to be just about critics are critics.
Here's a Melville in his novel Marty, which is kind of a dry run for Moby Dick. Has a passage, you wonder why he got so many bad reviews in his life. There's a passage where he says that critics are like, I really shouldn't forget, well, anyway, who cares? The critics are like mules who trample a rose garden and then mistake the crushed fragrance of the roses for their own fragrance.
Well, maybe you want to read the Mary McCarthy piece.
Well, I'm about to be reviewed. I have a play, an old play, 20-year-old play, opening at the Signature, Angels in America, and the critics are coming soon. So I was really happy when I was looking through the anthology and trying to decide what I wanted to read to find this essay, You're Always Loved by Mary McCarthy, who's a writer I really admire enormously, but who wrote drama criticism for The Nation, and got it wrong on a couple of occasions. And this is her review, Streetcar Called Success. It's a review of Streetcar Named Desire. You are an ordinary guy, and your wife's sister comes to stay with you. Whenever you want to go to the toilet, there she is in the bathroom, primping or having a bath or giving herself a shampoo and taking her time about it. You go and hammer on the door. For Christ's sakes, aren't you through yet? And your wife shushes you frowningly. Blanche is very sensitive, and you must be careful of her feelings. You get sore at your wife. Your kidneys are sensitive too. My God, you yell loud enough so that Blanche can hear you. Can't a man pee in his own house? When is she getting out of it? You are pretty sick, too, of feeling her criticize your table manners, and does she have to turn on the radio when you are having a poker game? Who does she think she is? Finally, you and your wife have a fight. You knew all along that she was turning the little woman against you. You decide to put your foot down. Blanche will have to go. Your wife reluctantly gives in. Anything for peace. Don't think it's been a treat for her. But let me handle it, Stanley. After all, she's my own sister. One way or another, God knows what your wife told her. Blanche gets the idea. You buy her a ticket home, but then right at the end, when you're carrying her bags downstairs for her, you feel sort of funny. Maybe you were too hard, but that's the way the world is, and boy, isn't it great to be alone. This variation on the mother-in-law theme is the one solid piece of theatrical furniture that A Streetcar Named Desire can show. The rest is antimacassars. Acrimony and umbrage, tears, door slamming, broken dishes, jeers, cold silences, whispers, raised eyebrows, the determination to take no notice, the whole classic paraphernalia of insult and injury is Tennessee Williams' hope chest. That the domestic dirty linen it contains is generally associated with the comic strip and the radio sketch should not invalidate it for him as subject matter. It has nobler antecedents. The cook, one may recall, is leaving on the opening page of Anna Karenina, and Hamlet at the court of Denmark is really playing the part of the wife's unwelcome relation. Dickens, Dostoevsky, Farrell rattle the skeleton of family life. There is no limit, apparently, to what people will do to each other in the family. Nothing is too grotesque or shameful. All laws are suspended, including the law of probability. Mr. Williams, at his best, is an outrageous writer in this category. At his worst, he is outrageous in another. Had he been, this is what I really love, had he been content in A Streetcar Named Desire with the exasperating trivia of the in-law story, he might have produced a wonderful little comic epic, The Struggle for the Bathroom. An epic ribald and poignant, a comédie larmoyante, which would have not been deficient either in those larger implications to which his talent presumes, for the bathroom might have figured as the last fortress of the individual, the poor man's club, the working girl's temple of beauty, and the bathtub and the toilet, symbol of illusion and symbol of fact, the prone and the upright, the female and the male, might have faced each other eternally in blank porcelain contradiction as the area for self-expression contracted to the limit of this windowless cell. Mr. Williams, however, like the Southern women he writes about, appears to have been mortified by the literary poverty of such material, by the pettiness of the arena, which is, in fact, its grandeur. Like Blanche Dubois in Streetcar Named Desire and the mother in A Glass Menagerie, he is addicted to the embroidering lie, and though his taste in fancy work differs from these ladies, inclining more to the modernistic, the stark contrast, the jagged scene, the jungle motifs, and then in parentheses, then they come together with low animal moans, which is a joke that Blanche makes in play. The tourist Mexican, Flores para los muertos, Coronas para los muertos, to clarinet music, suicide, homosexuality, rape, and insanity, his work creates in the end that very effect of painful falsity which is imparted to the Kowalski household by Blanche's pink lampshades and couch covers. I could go on, but I won't. She also got Iceman Cunliffe wonderfully wrong in the same way. So, thanks.
I put that in there to show how even a really keen intelligence can get something wrong as a critic, and I juxtaposed it as the very next piece with Harold Clurman's analysis of the first production of Streetcar Named Desire. Clurman pronounces it a masterpiece, but he says Kazan's production is wrong. Very interesting, because we tend to think of that production as the definitive one. And he says, basically, Marlon Brando is the most sensitive actor on the American stage. You don't put him in the role of a brute, a neo-fascist, because we then identify with Stanley and not with Blanche, particularly when the actress, in that case Jessica Tandy, is not as strong as the actor opposite her. So there is another unorthodox viewpoint, but coming from a very logical consideration of the play, and not quite as vituperative as McCarthy's. Which brings us actually, I think, to the question of actors and actresses and the balances on stage. One of the things that you can discover going through this anthology historically is how the actress gains respectability little by little. How it's very hard for respectable young women to go on the stage. They're considered whores. And perhaps you'd like to read a bit of Olive Logan's diatribe against the leg show in the 1860s and the 1870s.
Yes, when she gave up her career, she then dedicated herself to women's rights. Nudity on the stage. Let me just give you Olive Logan's chronology. Was 1839 and she died in 1909. Her favorite topics were equal rights for women and the condemnation of what she called the leg business. Regarding nudity on the stage, clothed in the dress of an honest woman, she is worth nothing to a manager. Stripped as naked as she dare, and it seems there is little left when so much is done. She becomes a prize to her manager, who knows that crowds will rush to see her and who pays her a salary accordingly. There are certain accomplishments which render the nude woman more valuable to managers in the degree that she possesses them. I will tell you what these accomplishments are, and you shall judge how far they go toward making her, in any true sense, an actress. They are, number 1, the ability to sing. Number 2, the ability to jig. Number 3, the ability to play on certain musical instruments. To sing, yes, but not to sing as Parepa, I guess that must have been an opera star, sings, nor such songs as she sings. The songs in demand in this sphere are vulgar, senseless, and to be most triumphantly successful should be capable of indecent constructions and accompanied by the wink, the wriggle, the grimace, which are not peculiar to virtuous women, whatever else they are. The more senseless the song, the more utterly it is idiotic drivel, the better it will answer in the absence of the baser requisites. Here's a specimen. Little Bo Peep, she lost her sheep and don't know where to find her. Leave her alone and she'll come home and fetch her tail behind her. A simple nursery song, and if men were babies, innocent and harmless in itself. But men are not babies. And the song is not sung in a simple or harmless matter, but with the wink and the idiotic stare that means a world and sets the audience into an ecstatic roaring. To jig, let no one confound jig dancing with the poetry of motion, which is illustrated by a thoroughly organized and thoroughbred body as ballet dancers. The ability to jig is an accomplishment which any of these nude creatures can pick up in a few weeks. And finally, the ability to play a certain musical instrument. These instruments should be such as to look queer in a woman's hands. Such instruments as the banjo and the bugle. And that's part of it.
So much for Gypsy.
Yeah, right.
Well, so much for wardrobe malfunctions.
Right.
Exactly. Exactly. Olive Logan was not alone in this attitude that what we now see as the origins of much musical comedy was particularly salacious, and much of it was meant to be.
I have an important story, a little one.
Oh, by all means.
In 1974, I did a play called Yentl by Isaac Singer at BAM, and it would travel to Broadway to the Eugene O'Neill Theater, produced by Victor Potamkin of Potamkin Cadillac, Mo Septi, an impresario of the Philly Pops, and Cheryl Crawford, one of the founders of the Actors Studio. And the play demanded that I lift my shirt up. I was 22, 23 years old. Lift my shirt up at the climax of the play, and I would not do it. I would not do it. I remember quoting Liv Ullmann saying, "My breasts are not actresses." And I remember offering to the director, God bless him, to stand with my breasts facing upstage and to be barebacked so that John Shea could see my breasts, but 1,000 people in the O'Neill Theater couldn't. So he wanted to replace me, and the producers wouldn't have it. They wouldn't have it. So fake breasts were built on top of my breasts, and I was to show the fake breasts every night. It was done by Carrie Robbins. And I remember lifting the tzitzit, the fringe, and I remember going like this, and every night the director would send the note back, "I cannot see your breasts," and I would write him back, "Come to my dressing room." and I remember feeling so strongly as an actor, and I'm not religious, though it's often pinned on me. I'm not particularly religious or fundamentalist or anything like that. But I knew that if I was naked at the climax of the play, that they wouldn't hear the text, they wouldn't hear what was happening. And it was a real problem. It's the only problem I've had with nudity ever since. I've since called that director. We're great friends, and I said, "I'm 30 odd years older. Let's do a revival of Yentl. I've got about 3 weeks left to show my breasts publicly."
I had a friend who was in the original cast of Hair, and he said that every night when the nude scene happened, you'd hear this odd click throughout the audience. And finally they figured out what it was. It was the opera glasses hitting the eyeglasses. Have either of you gentlemen censorship stories? Well, I know you've got plenty of censorship stories.
Fuck, 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 fuck. Paid my rent for 20 years. Speaking of hair, I think it was the first time fuck was said on an American stage. And it's a laugh that goes for nothing in this production that just happened. But one of the guys wandered downstage and said, "It's raining."
Ah.
It's fucking raining. And this gasp through the house. It's fucky fuck fucky fuck 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 fucky fuck fuck raining. And it's just the word, right? It was Lenny Bruce was there years before it got to a Broadway stage. But there was most of the reviews of American Buffalo were, if you took the profanity out, it would last 3 minutes. But here we are. I mean, and Mamet often says the difference between the 70s and at the time he said it, the 90s was, in the 70s you went into a drugstore and said, "I'd like 3 packs of Camels and some Trojans." And in the 90s you said, "I'd like 3 packs of Trojans and some Camels."
Tony, would you like to contribute to that?
No, I think I'll
Right. Okay. We're drawing briefly, we'll have a final round, but I've asked to announce that audience members who want to ask questions should take index cards and write them down, and then they'll be collected and handed up. So the index cards are coming around. I would like to read a poem by Don Marquis, and then we'll have maybe the last statements before the question period, all right? This is a poem from his Archie and Mehitabel series. Some of you may be very familiar with this. Archie was a cockroach who inhabited a newsroom in the 1920s, and late at night, after hours, he would crawl onto a typewriter and type out these poems, but of course he couldn't manage the shift key, so they're all in lowercase, and they're all just down the middle of the page. And they're usually about his friend Mehitabel, who is an alley cat of low morals and high spirits. And this one is called The Old Trooper. I ran onto Mehitabel again last evening. She's inhabiting a decayed trunk which lies in an alley in Greenwich Village, in company with the most villainous tomcat I had ever seen. But there's nothing wrong about the association, Archie, she told me. It is merely a plutonic attachment. And the thing can be believed, for that Tom looks like one of Pluto's demons. It is a theater trunk, and Tom is an old theater cat. He has given his life to the theater. He claims that Richard Mansfield once kicked him out of the way and then cried because he had done it and petted him. And at another time, he says, in a case of emergency, he played a bloodhound in a production of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The stage is not what it used to be, Tom says. He puts his front paw on his breast and says, they don't have it anymore. They don't have it here. The old troopers are gone. There's nobody can troop anymore. They're all amateurs nowadays. They haven't got it here. There are only 5 or 6 of us old-time troopers left. This generation does not know what stage presence is, what personality is, what they lack, personality. Where would they get the training my old friends got in the stock companies? I knew Mr. Booth very well, says Tom, and a law should be passed preventing anybody else from ever playing in any play he ever played in. There was a trooper for you. I used to sit on his knee and purr when I was a kitten. He used to tell me how much he valued my opinion. Finish is what they lack, finish, and they haven't got it here. And again he laid his paw on his breast. I remember Mr. Daly very well, too. I was with Mr. Daly's company for several years. There was art for you. There was teamwork. There was direction. They knew the theater, and they all had it here. For 2 years, Mr. Daly would not ring up the curtain unless I was in the prompter's box. They are amateurs nowadays, rank amateurs, all of them. For 2 seasons, I played the dog in Joseph Jefferson's Rip Van Winkle. It is true, I never came on the stage, but he knew I was just off, and it helped him. I would like to see one of your modern theater cats act a dog so well. that it would convince a trooper like Joe Jefferson. But they haven't got it nowadays. They haven't got it here. Joe Jefferson had it. He had it here. I come of a long line of theater cats. My grandfather was with Forrest. He had it. He was a real trooper. My grandfather said he had a voice that used to shake the ferry boats on the North River. Once he lost his beard, and my grandfather dropped from the fly gallery and landed under his chin and played his beard for the rest of the act. You don't see any theater cats that could do that nowadays. They haven't got it. They haven't got it here. Once I played the owl in Modjeska's production of Macbeth. I sat above the castle gate in the murder scene and made my yellow eyes shine through the dusk like an owl's eyes. Modjeska was a real trooper. She knew how to pick her support. I would like to see any of these modern theater cats play the owl's eyes to Modjeska's Lady Macbeth, but they haven't got it nowadays. They haven't got it here. Meherebel, he says, both our professions are being ruined by amateurs. So I would like to hear from you what you feel about the present state of the acting profession. All of you, because you're all dealing with actors one way or another. How are they trained? Are they responsive?
It's just scary how many good actors there are right now. You're spoiled for choice, really. Not that you can get the person you need to be in the play. You need that person to be in at the time you're doing the play. You're always tearing your hair out about that. But it's a wonderful time for American acting.
To what do you attribute this?
I don't know. I guess for the young actors, they're inspired by people like Sean Penn, who's, a truly great actor. It's tradition, I think.
We're back to the beginning.
But we are, Laurence, I think, and I guess that's what I want to close with. If you miss it by a generation, there was a moment in the late '80s, in 1989, when Steven Soderbergh made Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and a lot of really talented kids said, "Whatever he's doing, I want to be doing that." And there was this, as what's his name said in the campaign a long time ago, great whooshing sound, right? As everyone whooshed off to be part of this independent film movement. And then it turned out that that's the most Orwellian term in a long time. There is no independent film in America. And young people started to come back. But except for that moment of discontinuity, it's that you always want to connect. And if someone inspires you, it doesn't have to be Sean. There are a million actors it could be. But you want that. I think it's why we go into it partly, is you want to be part of a I'm going to just read. Do we have time for me? This is another part of the Tony thing I want to read, and at the risk of embarrassing Tony, it's silly to say who the best playwright is, but Tony's our most important playwright, and where does that come from? I've thought about this. Sorry, I've embarrassed it. Right before the reviews, too. That'll come back to haunt both of us. But it's just true. And I've thought so much about where that comes from. And I know, what inspired to David and other people to do it. But here's a little thing from the same essay. I first saw Arthur Miller in person at the 1994 Tony Awards when I sat behind him, too unnerved to introduce myself for the whole evening. I stared at the back of his head, which was far, far more interesting to me than anything transpiring on stage. Inside this impressive cranium, Miller had a huge head. Inside this impressive cranium, inside this dome, I thought to myself, Willy Loman was conceived. For an American playwright, a place comparable in sacrosanctity to the Ark of the Covenant or the Bodhi tree or the manger in Bethlehem. I wanted to touch the head, but I worried its owner might object. I'm going all the way back to the beginning. You want to be a part of something. There was a perfectly okay playing on Broadway a while ago, and I asked Miller what he thought of it, and I thought he was going to say, piece of junk. And he said, you know what? The only problem with that play is there aren't 20 plays just like it. Because the fact of the matter is, the idiots from Long Island, I think he said, can't tell the difference between this and Streetcar. And here's the beauty part. He said, but if you were an 18-year-old in the balcony, you sat there and you thought, I can write a better play than that. And in a way, that's been what's lost, but it's the same impulse to stare at Arthur's head and wonder how Willy Loman came out of that flesh and bone and synapses firing is a great thing. And at the risk of sounding flattering, I'm really glad you guys did this book because I think that's an important thing.
Of course, Tony now has to worry about who's sitting behind him.
Yes, indeed.
Tovah?
I agree with Greg, and I think the reason there's such a wellspring of ability is, again, back to the communications, that the communication highway has burgeoned. I, as an actor, when I researched Tallulah Bankhead, when I researched Sarah Bernhardt, I played Sarah Bernhardt. I went to the 5th floor of Lincoln Center. I was allowed in. There were very certain stringent rules, and there was a woman named Betty, whose last name escapes me at the moment, who ran it, who was wonderful to me, and I watched the few minutes of footage they had on Bernhardt again and again and again, and I went into certain files and saw original documents. But today, when I'm a scholar at the Museum of Television and Broadcasting to study Tallulah Bankhead, to study Golda Meir, to study Stella Adler, these are all women I've played, you know, you just call ahead, the stuff is ready, boom, boom, boom. I came here to the Library at Columbia and had 9 hours of tape transferred from the Museum of Tolerance to New York City of Irene Gut Opdijk, and spent my days at Columbia University, and it took a minute to arrange it. So the information highway is so much more available. I also remember starting, and I went to Sarah Lawrence, and I was a McKnight Fellow at the Guthrie Theater, where they paid for my master's. I never wrote my thesis at University of Minnesota. But the great actors I worked with, they were according to my parents' standard, uneducated, because they didn't go to university. A lot of them came out of high school from Canada and went right to Stratford, and they were extraordinary. They're extraordinary actors. But it's become, the schools in my lifetime have become codified. Yale and Juilliard and Carnegie Tech and many, many other programs have now bubbled up. Skidmore, places are on the map that weren't fully on the map in the old days. So people are coming out trained, and at base, again, in support of Greg, I think we all want to gather around the campfire called the story. We want to hear a story well told. I'm interested in being with you live, that's theater, or being with a camera so they record the story and we all go to a movie theater. I have the honor of voting for the Oscars. And the difference in screening a movie in your den, even on a large television, or going to a movie theater is palpable. And I much prefer the latter. I want to be with people, to hear a good story told, and that hasn't changed for millennia. And I agree. The other thing that's changed a great deal in my career is this thing called the reading. They now pay you $100 for a 29-hour reading, but you won't believe who shows up. We just did Ruthless. I did it with Betty Buckley, myself, and Leslie Kritzer. I'm now doing a piece called Fashion for David Zippel with Mary Testa, Christiane Knoll, some of the great singers of New York. Just great. I just did Somerset Maugham's Our Betters with Michael Urie, because I could never get a chance to do it, and Joanna Gleason and myself. So that's happening, and the $100 a day independent film, where anybody and his mother can now almost afford to make a film. So the film monopoly, that's it, the monopolies in my time have broken down. Even the monopoly of the New York Times. Look at the poor little New York Times. I feel badly for it. The producers know how to use the internet. The producers know how to do things that don't cost anything. So it's a wonderful, rich time in the entertainment world because of the accessibility of communication and merchandising of your product. And some of it's very interesting. YouTube can be very interesting, very useful.
Thank you. Tony?
So what's the question?
What was the question again? The question, well, actually, maybe we should turn to some of these questions because I think they apply. and several of them have a resemblance to one another.
I'll say one thing about acting in New York.
Okay.
That is a concern of mine. I mean, I agree with everything that Tovah and Greg have said. I remember, though, when I first got to New York, when Classic Stage Company was run by Chris Martin, and there was an enormous pool of really wonderfully trained and experienced theater actors who were all doing soap operas, and there was so much soap opera production in New York. These people could do, basically supported this, as I remember, a rather good classic repertory theater because they had day jobs doing soap. Well, opera's now dying as a form. Law and Order is pretty much over, and Law and Order has been, the sort of the secret funding source for New York theater for several
18
decades.
years. 18 years.
I mean, every actor, in every actor's bio, in every playbill in the last 18 years, it says you played so-and-so in Law and Order, and that's gone. And I think we're facing a lot of competition with the immense amount of production going on in cable television, and really good stuff that's being filmed. So it's becoming a little bit more difficult to get actors. And I think that probably people have always complained about this, but I'm discovering more and more young actors, especially, who are quite successful in film or television, but who have no training as a stage actor and don't know the kind of technical skills that you need to hit the beige
Right,
wall.
that's right, to share.
And have instead learned a kind of an acting that's as legitimate as stage acting. It just doesn't work on stage as well. Of a kind of, you produce behavior for the camera and you do 50 takes, and then one of them will be the one that the director wants to use, but it's not quite the same thing as being able to create the illusion of spontaneity or whatever illusion it is you happen to be trying to create night after night after night after night, and to have, the ability to really read and analyze text and so on. I think that there's this vast industry of undergraduate theater training, which is mostly, I think, fairly worthless, not to mention the way that it undermines liberal arts education, which is what undergraduate education should be, not vocational training, not training when I went to Columbia as an undergraduate, there was no theater major, there was no arts major.
Correct.
Remember, there is now, and I think it's a great shame that there is. I wish Columbia was still holding out against that. And the graduate schools that can really teach acting are remarkable, but there aren't all that many of them. They're very expensive. So, I think there's a bit of a crisis, I think, in producing for a country of this size, generations of really well-trained stage actors who can do Shakespeare, who can do Johnson, who can really do difficult material. And that worries me a little bit. There's not enough financial support and I think misdirection in other areas, so I'm concerned about it.
Well, I think this segues very neatly into a rather provocative question. How do you feel about the takeover of Broadway by retellings of Hollywood movies? While it certainly does fill the seats with asses, do you think it's damaging the integrity and creativity of the stage?
I don't think Brief Encounters is damaging anything. I think it's clever as hell and very interesting. It breaks form for us. I found it extremely touching and entertaining. So that I'm okay with. But it was, I thought, it also was ironically put together by a company out of Devon and Cornwall in a barn, and this company has lived together for years, like what happened in Chekhov's time, group theater and whatnot. But I don't know about the other stuff. I mean, like Singing in the Rain and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang was not my cup of tea. But,
I've learned one thing, and that is the audience can tell how you rehearsed.
Wow.
If you rehearse with, sorry to be corny, but love and respect, the audience senses that. Wow. If you rehearse with, oh, we're going to get him on this one, the audience figures it out. I don't know how the audience figures it out. I just know that they do.
That's incredible.
And
That's incredible.
it's just true.
You're brilliant.
So I don't think it matters where the story comes from. I think that you have to rehearse with respect for each other, with respect for the material, with respect for the people who are, for the people who are going to come see it. If you think it's 1,088 miniature ATM machines who have arrived on 45th Street every night, and you're going to extract your $125, well, the hell with you. You should close.
No.
And, I I think always bears repeating that so little of what matters to the American theater, especially I think now, has all that much to do with Broadway, which is not, as I think some people feel, sort of the apogee, the sort of the thing towards which everyone is striving. I think that it's a commercial venue. It's a collection of some of the most spectacular proscenium arch theaters on the planet. Many of which have been crammed so full of seats that they're miserably uncomfortable to sit in.
Like airplanes.
Right. But then others have been beautifully maintained. The Jew Jamsons have certainly done a fantastic job with that. And they're wonderful to perform in, but they're not the perfect venues for everything. And most of what's really significant and important in American theater has emerged from elsewhere. I think that's been true for the last 20 years. So, I think Broadway's always had, when I was first on Broadway with Angels in the Walter Kerr, I was actually leading Al Hirschfeld, who got lost backstage and was trying to get across. He was quite old at that point. And I was leading, I ran into him and I recognized him from his drawings. And I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm lost. I need to get under the stage to the other side." And I was leading him and we wound up in this place where there were these weird cement troughs. And I said, "I don't know what those are." And he said, "Oh, those are seal ponds." And they were used in vaudeville when the Walter Kerr was a vaudeville house to keep trained seals for the seal acts.
Oh my gosh.
So, there's a big thrill in that, the connection that you have when you go into one of those theaters to this, to American theater history. Yeah. But it's also always been the case that Broadway has had its version of, trained seal acts. And dog acts and so on. And some of these musicals are essentially the modern day equivalent of that. And I don't, as long as they keep nice people employed, it's fine.
And it might be the beginning. I mean, God bless Al Pacino. Do you know how many people are going to see Merchant because this movie star is in it? And he's a good actor, and he's a devoted actor, and he loved his teacher. He loved Lee Strasberg, and he hasn't given up the fight, for the truth. God bless it, and that's going to keep a lot of people employed and bring the people from Long Island and from New Jersey maybe to see their first Shakespeare play. When Joe DiMaggio was hitting home runs year after year, one of the little kids came up to him and said, Joe, why do you keep hitting those homers? And he says, "I keep hitting them because somebody ain't never seen baseball."
There's several questions here. Some of them are directed specifically to Tovah about what would you tell an actress who's beginning her career, and other people, what do you tell young actors? And also, what do you tell a young playwright? How does a young playwright get a start? So, what are the challenges?
Well, why don't I do young actors and you do playwrights?
Oh, God. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, good.
Young playwrights? I don't know. I think write plays and make sure that you get them produced one way or another. And think long and hard before you go to playwriting graduate programs, because I'm not sure that I really completely believe that you can teach. I think you can teach actors and directors and designers. I'm not sure that I'm right about this, but I stopped teaching at the graduate dramatic writing program at NYU because I taught some wonderful playwrights. Some of them have gone on to be Christopher Shin and people like that, and Rena Groff. Their success has had nothing whatsoever to do with anything I taught them. I don't know that it's something that can be taught. I think it's a craft that's learned partly by studying antecedent form and by reading everything from Aeschylus onward, and really understanding where the idea of narrative in this particular and dialectic in this particular machine comes from. And part of it is learned in the rehearsal room and being around actors and directors doing their work. So become an assistant stage manager, do props for a show, hang out in a rehearsal room, get coffee for a good director, and watch what happens in a rehearsal room. And then write and know that unless you can see it on stage with actors and an audience, you're not going to be able to develop as a playwright, because that's just an absolutely irreducible part of what, unless you're, there are 2 or 3 playwrights I can think of who mostly didn't see their work performed who amounted to anything. But playwrights need that. It's absolutely essential that you see production. So if you can't get somebody to produce your work, it doesn't cost much to do it, and there are always a lot of people who are talented around,
And this is where the reading might come in.
Readings are not, it's a good idea to aim for, when I started out, I had a little theater company, and we rented tiny little rooms around New York, and we did productions. And I think it's a really important thing to take control of that. If it's not opening up for you immediately, you need it to grow as a writer, and I think that's immensely important. So.
Now, I remember when students would come to me asking what graduate programs in directing they ought to go to. I'd say, pick the one that allows you to do the most directing.
Yeah.
Tovah?
I tell an actor what Ruth Gordon told me. She says, Tovah, darling, never give up, never give up. It's what Joe Campbell says about following your bliss. But I also tell young actors, I teach up at Yale, and I think we teach the way we want to be taught. So I teach the actor's approach to a song. I teach the actor how to own a lyric, how to own a word, as if they were birthing it in front of you. That Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein have done their work, but they're there now, and I'm with you. So I'm going to own it and skin this cat like nobody's ever done it, except for Greg Mosher's revival of View from the Bridge, which was one of the great moments of my theatrical life.
Thank you.
And really was birthed. And I had the honor of playing with Liev Schreiber. He played my son in A Walk on the Moon. And he's just a great actor, and his intelligence informs everything. I would also tell an actor to originate their own work. And actually, I would say, do you have anything to say? Is there anything you want to write and speak of? Is there any way you can birth your own work so you don't have to wait like krill at the bottom of a food chain for a call from other people that you are useful or not useful to them? How can you define yourself as an artist regardless of your employment? So there's a conundrum there, but it can be done. One of the greatest things I ever did in my career, and it took me 30 years to figure it out. First, you write an act. So I did an act with Wally Harper, and we did it at the Algonquins. That was the first thing. I wrote monologues. But the best thing I did is I acquired the rights to Golda's Balcony, like Eva Le Gallienne, like Catherine Cornell. I acquired the rights to one of my biggest hits. And I'm the producer of that show now. That's the show I take out like White Christmas, not as a seal act or a cart and pony show, but a way to support myself without having to do soap operas. And I learned a lesson, because I'm looking at work for Daryl Roth, whom I love. And I learned that when you're a producer of your show, guess what you're paid by the presenter? You're paid for the show. Then you pay Tovah Feldshuh. You pay her minimum. Send that 10% of that to your agent. But you're paid for the show in the thousands of dollars. And you make a living. And you bloody deserve it. And there's no, it's a very different situation. There are 2 channels going on, but I love it. It's my first foray into business, business. So I would also suggest to an actor to try to originate their work. Try. And you reach for the stars, you can land on the roof. You reach for the roof, you never get off the ground. That's what I would say.
How are you doing on time? All right. By the way, Greg, did you want to contribute to that in any way?
No, just to say that all the training and everything is so codified now. And I just tell young people, don't ask for permission, which is what you're both saying. Don't ask for permission. Just go do it. I used to bribe the janitors with cheap wine to let me stay and work late. I wasn't supposed to be directing a play at 10 o'clock at night. They wanted to close the building.
Where?
Juilliard. I gave away a lot of Thunderbird.
I was for reasons I won't go into, I was looking up, trying to find an Oscar acceptance speech about 2 weeks ago, and we came across Ruth Gordon's acceptance speech when she won the Oscar for Rosemary's Baby, and she was what, like 80 years
In her
old,
80s, 78, yeah, 78.
Old, and she'd already, written all these things with Garson Kanin. She'd been Abe Lincoln in Illinois in 1906, or whatever, and she got she went
With Lincoln.
With Lincoln. She did. She got the Oscar. She said, "I just can't tell you how encouraging this is."
She's very encouraging. And she was the matron of honor at my wedding, and she said, I'll never forget it, "Tovah, can I cut the dress?" I said, "What are you talking about?" She says, "Well, I broke my legs, so they're very beautiful, and I'd like to show my legs at your wedding." I said, "My wedding, my wedding." And she wore her long gown, and she was a matron of honor. She went, "Rabbi, when do I lift the veil? Rabbi, when do I give her the wine?" But she was a scream and a great soul, and it was a great love affair. I worked with her. I learned a lot from her. I learned a lot from Rosemary Harris. It's what Lynn Redgrave says, and she probably got it from her dad. Have some taste from whom you steal. Whom are you going to steal from, Or from whom are you going to steal, as my father would say. And to be with Rosemary Harris doing Three Sisters, I was just married to Andy, and I'm Three Sisters with Rosemary Harris and Ellen Burstyn, so I had the pillar of the Actors Theater. I had the pillar of British acting with a 5-octave range, and then there was little me in the middle, and Frank Dunlap directing us. And I said, if I just listen to my sisters, it'll all be okay. I'll just respond to them. I think, who is it? Is it Malcolm Gladwell that says it takes 10,000 hours to become a master? So as our life accumulates, even some mediocre actors in their youth become great actors when they're older, because they get their 10,000 hours, and the body can no longer muscle stuff through. Air substitutes for muscle, and they become more organic, more organic.
And then, if this were Japan, they would become national treasures. I think on the stage we have 3 national treasures, and I'd like to give them a big hand.
To our moderator as well, Laurence Senelick, and to the panel, thank you. Just a final word. My name is Jeremy Dalbir. I'm the director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, the third of this trinity, if I may use a non-Jewish expression. It's a great delight to have listened to this conversation. I think we covered every possible category in the course of this. Hearing this, I was reminded of a novel by the Yiddish writer Shalom Aleichem, a novel called Wandering Stars that Tony Kushner actually wrote an introduction for. It's out in translation. And in that novel, which is a novel of the theater, Shalom Aleichem describes the incredible attraction that Jews in the shtetl had to the Yiddish theater that comes to town. And they see this, Shalom Aleichem writes this, as a way of their introduction to an outside world, to a modern world. But reading this, I realized once again the kinds of things that we all do here, which is to say that the Jewish story, the discovery of the excitement and the challenge of putting on masks and realizing that they're only masks and you can be whatever you want, that Jewish story of the modern world is just a story. It's just the story of what the theater does for everybody in all times and all places. And we're delighted to see that this group weaves together the Jewish story, the non-Jewish story, and the story of the theater in this volume and in their work. So thank you again. And I know that all of you just have 2 questions, which are first, where can I buy the book that all these people are reading about? And the second is, will the lovely panelists agree to sign my volume if I buy it? And the answer to the first is over there, and the answer to the second is yes. If you are interested, the books are on sale from the Library of America right in the back, and our panelists have very graciously agreed to sign the volumes if you come back up here with your newly bought copy. And so with that, I will thank them for that and for so much else. Thank you all. Have a good night.